So today's video is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to be talking about any particular technique or physical issue or anything like that when it comes to playing the violin. Instead, I want to address a particular problem that I've noticed in almost all violin students. And like I said before, it's not a problem strictly of technique or movement. It's a problem of mindset. It's a problem of what you're focusing on in your practice that is severely holding you back in your progress. I'm Tobiah Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. So what is this problem mindset, this misplaced priority of your focus while you're playing that is causing your problems and making you still be an amateur violinist? Well, to put it very simply, you are focusing a lot more on what happens on this side of the equation rather than this. And I perfectly understand why this is the case. If you didn't play the violin at all and you were watching a violinist play, you would naturally have your eyes drawn to what is happening with the left hand over the fingerboard. And so, therefore, when you start to learn to play the violin, it makes sense that you would be focusing on what you're doing here in your left hand more than what you were doing with your bow. Now, this would be what we might call a rookie mistake, if I didn't also happen to see people that have gotten to a fairly advanced level still having this misplaced focus. And to be honest, I used to be one of these people. However, if you ever get the chance to hang out with any older professional violinists, you'll notice that when they talk about violinists that they most particularly admire, almost everything they talk about is the person's bow arm. The reason for this is, and this might be very surprising to many of you, but everything that's happening over here is the easy part of learning to play the violin. This is where the true difficulty lies. You see, when you're doing something wrong in the left hand, it's usually pretty obvious what you did wrong and why. If a note's out of tune, if it's not very clean, if the finger hit the wrong string, if you have your wrist in a bad position, your elbow in a bad position, most of those things, especially if a teacher points it out to the student, are fairly obvious and something the student can immediately get to work on. But the proper execution of violin bow technique is so subtle that sometimes even when a teacher points out to a student what they're doing wrong, it takes many, many tries and maybe even many lessons before the student starts to understand exactly what they're supposed to do and how. Let's take something as simple as being able to do a basic long bow stroke from frog to tip and tip to frog on an open string. Seems like the simplest thing in the world, right? Well, any of you that have tried to do that recently maybe have found out actually isn't so simple. That basic bow stroke is the foundation, in my opinion, of violin bowing technique, which means it's the foundation of tone production, which means it's the foundation of violin playing itself, because violin playing is nothing if it's not about the sound. And it often takes students months to appropriately execute that bow stroke. To accomplish this, you have to have basic control of the fingers so you can get an even distribution across both ends of the bow, because the bow is not evenly weighted, so you have to take care of that here. You have to ingrain this very two-dimensional motor pattern here in the arm so the bow is not wobbling and therefore bouncing while you're doing it. You also have to make sure that you're primarily moving from the elbow and not from the shoulder so that the bow stays straight from one end of the bow to the other. All of these things just to play an open string. And it only gets more complicated from there. So all of the time that you've spent practicing scales and etudes and exercises to develop your left hand technique, all of which is time very well spent. I'm not saying you shouldn't practice on that. However, if you don't balance it out with even more focus in practice on your right arm, then you could have the left hand of Paganini and it wouldn't mean a thing. Nobody wants to hear someone flittering around the fingerboard with crappy sound and a bad bow technique. However, you could have an incredible bow arm and an adequate left hand, and far more people would want to listen to you play. Funny thing is, I actually don't know anybody that has a fantastic bow arm that doesn't also have a really, really good left hand, because you can focus on your left hand technique and completely ignore your bow arm. However, it is almost impossible to focus on your bow arm and not get a little bit of left hand technique practice thrown in for good measure. For instance, if you take the book that I use after I teach people how to do longbows properly, which is Sevcik Opus 2, which is definitely the best book for sandblasting someone's bowing technique, you will find that in the opening, where it's just a lot of long tones, that Sevcik is able to throw in some very good exercises for hand frame. For instance, within these long tones, he has string crossings, and during the string crossings, he instructs the student to hold all 4 fingers down at the same time as they build through the sequence. So we start here, open string, 3rd finger on the D string here, hold down 3rd finger, then go to 1st finger, then go back to 3rd finger, then 2nd finger, holding all 3 fingers down now, and then holding all 3 fingers down, you get to place 4th finger. Now here I have this nice hand frame position, which is a little bit different than I would get from playing some scales. So Sevcik, who knew what he was doing beyond probably anyone else of his time, was able to, within this bowing exercise, still get the student, who would be, at a pretty unadvanced level when they were practicing this, hopefully, to be able to also work on aspects of their left-hand technique. However, when you're doing Sevcik Opus 1, which is entirely based around the left hand, it is very easy to get what you need out of those books without really caring that much about the sound quality. And because the proof of good or bad bow technique is what kind of sound you're producing, when you're focusing on your bow arm, you're also going to be listening a lot closer than if you're just focusing on what's happening here in your left hand, which means you'll probably end up playing a lot more in tune and a lot cleaner from focusing a little bit more on what happens with your bow arm than if you put all of that energy in trying to make sure that your left hand was moving in just the right way. Now, for a real-world example of why you should be focusing more on your bow arm when you're practicing than your left hand, I would like you to turn to the 3rd movement of the Bruch Violin Concerto, because with all of the thirds and tenths and all of the famous double stops and things that happen within that movement, this left-hand stuff is actually the easy part. The most difficult part, and the thing you should be focusing on the most when you're learning that piece, is in fact the bow arm. Let's go to the practice room. Okay, this little bit is actually not that complicated when it comes to the left hand. If you set your hand up properly, you can do that shift with the little motion of the wrist back and forth. However, if you don't have a very clear idea of what you're going to be doing with the arm and have a very clean motion and there's kind of a throwing of the bow around from the shoulder, which is what I often see happen, then it doesn't matter how good you have all of this here in place, because none of that is going to sound good at all. Now, something like this, that's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more awkward for the left hand. However, if you don't primarily here as well put the emphasis on what the bow is doing, then you are still going to end up with a very, very messy sound no matter how perfectly you put your fingers there. And then if it's messy, it doesn't matter if it's in tune. If it has a bad sound, it doesn't matter if it's in tune. And very often when we put the focus here on the right arm, in these awkward left-hand passages, the left hand actually often loosens up and sort of takes care of itself so long as we have adequately practiced. And then if you move on to a lot of these string crossings that happen a little bit later, like... So, in order to make those sound like not slapping the bow across the string, you actually have to have very subtle movement here in the fingers and in the bow arm. So we have this... There actually has to be a little bit of on the string start, not just a throwing the bow at the string, with also a lift in the string crossing here, going back and forth. Okay, so you have to be able to turn that motion, that very, very refined motion going, into something that actually works with this that's happening in the hand. And then there's also the idea of setting up the arm here. So we have this before. So right after that we have the. So if you're not careful there, and you come off of that sixth way up in the air, which is the natural thing you would do with the bow, when you come down, if you're not careful about exactly how you're placing the bow, either you could do it up here and get that, or down here, which is what I prefer. If you're not very careful about how you control and place the bow before you go, you're going to end up with a sort of crash landing right there, and it's not going to be clear no matter what you do in your left hand. And like I said before, the more you focus on what you're doing here, it actually tends to relax and to loosen up what you're doing in your left hand. Okay, and the entire piece is essentially this way. Okay, if you focus on what is happening in your right arm, not only are you going to free up the left hand in terms of its execution, but you're also going to make sure all of the things that you practiced here in your left hand actually come out in a way that sounds good and resonant and is going to be something that people want to listen to. Anyway, this is something that I thought needed to be addressed. The violin is as much a mental battle as it is a physical one, so sometimes reordering our focus and our mindset and even just what we're focusing on can make as big a difference in our playing as, practicing scales for a couple of hours, which you should still do. Anyway, I've been Tobias Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, always here to push you forward and remind you there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.